and welcome to The Shift, the podcast that aims to tell the no-holds-barred truth about being a woman post-40, created and hosted by me, writer and broadcaster Sam Baker. Now, I have known today's guest for quite some time, decades, in fact. To begin with, she didn't really know me because she was friends with my first ever boss. But during the times I sat on the sidelines of Lindsay Nicholson's life, the unimaginable happened, and her husband and then daughter both died of a rare form of leukemia. Then she picked herself up and her younger daughter Hope, and they rebuilt their lives. Already a successful editor, she became editor of Good Housekeeping, where she stayed for 18 years, winning countless awards. As if she hadn't had more than her fair share of shit already, Lindsay was then diagnosed with breast cancer, and she's been in remission for 17 years. Then I left magazines, and our ways kind of parted, as they do. But a couple of years later, I began to hear rumours. Her second marriage to a man who from the outside looked like some kind of knight in shining Armani, fallen apart. Magazines were in trouble, and the company we both worked for had dispensed with their experienced, talented, for which read expensive, editors, including her, perhaps their most senior and decorated. Now, you might think that would be more than enough, but it wasn't even the half of it.
If it wasn't the car crash, it would have been something else. Because look, someone else might have had that car crash. And if they weren't busy suppressing and I don't know whether my husband was having the affair at that point, could have been in that car crash that I was in. And their response could have been, wow, that was scary. That was horrible. I feel really upset by it. But hey, nobody died.
Now Lindsay has written a heart-rending memoir, Perfect Bound, about the car crash that triggered a crisis and losing it all for a second time. Her obsessive pursuit of perfection and finding it in herself to recover again. But before we leap in, I do have to be honest. This episode is, in places, a lot of everything. Such a lot of joy, but also a lot of pain, including suicidal ideation. You name it, Lindsay has been through it. So if you're feeling fragile, please do proceed with caution and maybe bring tissues. Was it hard writing the book? I mean, because it is, even knowing you, not close, but for a long time, and thinking I knew a lot of your story was mind-blowing. I mean, look how many corners I've turned over. And let me tell you, that is not normal.
No, it was, I sort of had to write it. I sort of didn't have a choice.
Yeah, I hear you.
I wanted to do other things. What I wanted to do was write a novel. Wrote a novel, it was terrible. It was terrible.
I know that feeling too.
And I just had to write this and I didn't want to write it. And, I didn't want to have to tell people about what had happened, but I couldn't stop.
Yeah. I mean, do you think, is it a way of reprocessing it a bit?
God,
or had you processed?
Yeah, absolutely needed. It was, I had lots of therapy as well, but I needed to process it. As we know, writing is a great way of processing stuff, but it's hard. You don't want to do it. I'd rather process it by having massages, quite frankly.
Exactly, by eating chocolate. I don't know. I think that people, and by people I include publishers, I think that they have no idea how hard writing a memoir is. If you have the slightest bit of trauma without the immense amount of trauma that you had. And it's strange, isn't it? Because we're sat in this very swanky meeting room in your publishers, and you and I have sat in swanky meeting rooms a lot in our careers, not for a long time. In fact, the only time I do sit in swanky meeting rooms now is when I'm doing something like this. Do you miss it?
There was a lot of things in my life that I wasn't doing because I had this fabulous job which occupied every waking minute. And there were other things in my life that I needed to do.
Yeah, I think there were many moments, obviously none of which were associated to some of the traumatic events in your life, but there were many things that you said throughout about how much you gave to the job, and the constant working, and the being grateful to be there, and putting the job before everything else. And I was kind of just nodding along because I absolutely did.
I mean, I don't think younger women feel the same way, that they have to,
that shit.
that they are grateful to be there. I mean, obviously, lots of people have lovely jobs that they enjoy very much, and they think, well, this is, what I'm worth. I deserve it. I'm doing a good job. Thank you. But I'm a bit older than you, particularly for my generation. It was, oh my God, I can't believe someone's letting me do this. I better not make a fuss. I better not have a picture of my children on my desk.
Yeah. I mean, before we go into it, if you can bear to go into it, I wanted to talk to you a bit about perfection, because really that's what the book is about, isn't it? It's about all the unreasonable quantity of shit that has been thrown at you throughout your life. But it's about seeking perfection and trying to make everything look perfect.
It's not just making it look perfect for other people. I think it's very much this good girl thing. If you're perfect, more bad stuff won't happen. And if bad stuff happened, it's because you weren't perfect enough. God, that's a hard way to live. Almost the awful thing about it is that if you live that way, then you get very rewarded in the world of work. So no one's saying to you, don't be perfect. They're saying to you, fantastic, here's an award, here's a pay rise.
Be more perfect.
Be more perfect. We love you being. And then, of course, they discover not just work, but the people in your life and so on, discover that they can push your button and make you more perfect, make you be more perfect. Yeah. And by hinting that you're not perfect, they can send you running towards this perfection.
Where do you think the good girl perfection thing started for you?
My parents were from the East End of London. They were very ambitious for a better life, which was then very set back by the fact that my father got cancer at the age of 39, 40. So we were very, very hard up for several years. But there was this belief that if only you tried hard enough, if you strove hard enough, then you would have this life that was better. And I was the eldest girl. I think it came from there. And then, of course, it did happen. I did pass lots of exams. I did get great jobs. So where was the thing that was saying perfection may not always work out? And then my first husband, John, who I loved, adored, still love, adore, died. And he was very, very, very talented. He was chief reporter of The Observer, and he died at 35. And so I think I took his ambition, his striving into me as well. I felt I had to achieve things for him as well.
All the way through the book, it feels like, I can get through this, I can survive this, I can work my way out of this if I just keep going. It was like a badge of honour. Yeah,
I did. After John died, I was pregnant. I was 4 months pregnant. I took 3 weeks off and went back to work. And then my daughter, Ellie, got ill.
Your eldest daughter,
My eldest daughter, Ellie. Yeah, she got ill with leukemia, the same as her father had had, at age 9. And I worked from her hospital room. She was in isolation a lot of the time. And after she died, I went back to work, even though my younger daughter, Hope, was only 5 years old.
Where did the kind of work as the safe space come from, do you think? I mean, I get it. I totally get it.
Well, work is a safe space. I mean, it was awful. Those years were horrific. But I strongly remember going back to work 3 weeks after John died. And I was pregnant, visibly pregnant. And I'd left Ellie at home with the nanny. And everyone was kind of looking at me. I worked on Woman magazine at that point. Everyone was sort of looking at me in horror as I walked down the corridor. But then it was busy. I remember that by lunchtime of that day, people had stopped tiptoeing around me. And then it became this refuge that for 8-10 hours a day, I could be a normal person.
Because whilst you were bringing up Hope on your own, you went from woman to editor of Prima, swept up all the awards there because you're such an overachiever, and I'm being flippant, but you did. And then, so what was happening in your life when you were made editor of Good Housekeeping?
So I was made editor of Good Housekeeping 1 year after Ellie died. So realistically, I was deep in grief, but I wasn't. I mean, it's not just me that has capacity. Anyone has this capacity if they're deep in grief for denial and dissociation. So I was deep in denial, deep in dissociation. I was working very, very hard. I was made editor of the year. I didn't feel bad about leaving Hope with the nanny because I didn't think I was a good parent around her at home, because my grief was so bad, I needed that escape. I was made editor of Good Housekeeping in 1999. I was already editor of the year. I went into work. I worked. Good Housekeeping was in decline at that point. Everyone was saying, magazine like that never make it into the 21st century. Well, give me a challenge. Nothing I wanted more than a challenge that would utterly absorb every waking minute. And so I threw myself at it. And then on Friday evenings, after the sales figures came in, I would go home and then I would have a weekend of not thinking about work at all. And then on Monday morning, I'd do it all over again. I mean, obviously I went home every evening, but there were a lot of evening functions.
Yeah, I was going to say, you probably weren't home for very long, were you? I mean, I definitely had times where I would barely get home before midnight and then be out the door again at God knows what time the next morning. Yeah,
but the weekends always just totally, and, there are advantages to being a single parent. I mean, I didn't have another adult to consider. We could eat ready meals, basically, which is what we did. And I just hung out with Hope for the whole weekend, then went back to this insane world, which, I was working really hard, but I was very well rewarded. I had a dress allowance, which you remember. I went to all these champagne receptions every evening. I went to fashion weeks. I talked to brilliant writers and photographers. It was amazing.
Yeah, so it's that kind of, it's the contrast. I think all the way through the book, the feeling is the contrast between the kind of the personal and the professional is immense and getting bigger, isn't it? So you met Mark 2004. So
2003. We married in 2004. We married 1 year after we met.
And how long have you been on GH at that point?
I'd been on GH 5 years at the point that I got married. Yeah.
It's astonishing, isn't it? Because that feels like literally that time. I think I was on Company and then Cosmo. Feels like kind of yesterday.
It does, yes.
And it's decades ago now.
Yeah, it's 20 years ago. Yeah.
And what was it about Mark that made you think, actually, Hope has never known her dad. I want to bring someone else into our lives at this point where you've got them all on an even keel and you're...
I was desperately lonely, desperately. With hindsight, so we married 6 years after Ellie's death, after the death of a child, it was 12 years after John's death. I was still in trauma. I shouldn't have married anyone.
Did you know that then?
No.
You only know it now because...
People didn't talk about trauma then.
No, PTSD wasn't a thing then,
no,
was
it wasn't. Now everyone's got it.
But they didn't know that it was, yeah.
I had counselling, but no one really knew. No one really talked that much about that. He was very kind. He was very funny, made me laugh. And he was intensely practical around the house. He got planks and nails and things and so on, which I couldn't do. So I saw him as a rescuer.
I was going to say, so there was you've been having to try and keep everyone safe, and along comes this person who can keep you safe.
Yes.
Look after the person who's been doing all the looking after.
Yeah.
So you married really quickly. And then, I know this feels like an absolute litany, but it was an absolute litany. Yeah. Then 2 years later, you got breast cancer, that's right?
I did. So I was editing Cosmo at that time, because when you'd gone off to Red.
Right, I just left, yeah.
Yeah. So I took over Cosmo and I was newly married, happily married. Hope loved having a dad because she'd never known her actual father, so she'd never really grieved him. And one of the reasons we got married so quickly was because she was changing schools and we wanted her to be able to go to her new school with a regular family rather than my dad's dead, which she used to say in the playground, which used to cause quite a bit of fuss.
Oh dear, yeah, that's not something they want the other kids to think about.
So we wanted to be a regular family, and we were. And then 2 years in, by that time I was editorial director of the whole national magazine company. So I was editing Cosmo in the morning and Esquire in the afternoon, it was heaven. I was so happy and everything was perfect. And for Cosmo, I went to New York to interview John Bon Jovi. Such a Cosmo
How did you manage to swing that?
Well, because the thing came in, do you want to send someone to interview John Bon Jovi? And I'm like, yes, I think that's a job for the editor. And I found a lump. I knew that people I loved could die. I hadn't realised that I was human, really. And it absolutely floored me. And I could not speak. And of course, I had this really important job on these magazines and so on. And people were ringing and trying to find out what was happening. I couldn't speak. And Mark took charge. And he was the one that told Hope. He was the one that told my mother, handled all the phone calls with work, and was there when I came round from surgery.
Very romantically.
Yes, in the suit that he'd worn for our wedding with roses and champagne, because it was Valentine's Day. I had my surgery on Valentine's Day.
Oh, dear God.
I know, there's something about me, isn't there, that I kind of go for drama. You've always got an eye for a
story.
I know. So I had chemotherapy and radiation treatment. I ended up having a number of surgeries because they went back in and took more margins and took out all the lymph nodes. And I wasn't off work. I was working from home for 8 months. Lost all my hair. It was Mark that shaved my head. And I thought I was going to die. I just assumed I was going to die because everyone always dies of cancer.
And what were you thinking? Because, Hope had lost a dad she'd never known. She'd lost her sister.
I was very glad I'd married Mark. I was very glad she had someone. I mean, my family are very strong, very supportive, always have been. And you've
got a very close network of friends.
And and they have absolutely carried me through everything. By being married, by having Mark, when I died, and I really saw it as when, she wouldn't have to leave her home. That was really important. So I just assumed I was going to die. And then I was waiting for the radiation treatments, days, 30-something sessions, goes on forever. And I was waiting in the waiting room. And I was treated in Harley Street because of the work, private healthcare. And it was all very fancy and so on. And I was used to sweeping stuff. I had one of the first electric cars, one of those tiny little ones.
Oh, yes.
And I used to drive into Harley Street, park sideways on because it was so tiny, and then sweep in and have my radiation treatment. And I swept in. I could still pull this editor persona out of the bag, even though I was falling apart.
It was a persona, wasn't it? It was something you wore.
Absolutely. Like a very nice designer outfit. It was a nice thing to wear.
Was it all the whole, because it's attitude, expression, hair, everything. Was it like armour?
Yeah. But it was armour from the turmoil and the grief inside of me.
Reverse armour.
Yeah. So I arrived for my radiation treatment and I was delayed. And so I went and very editor-like said to the receptionist, "Excuse me, I've been waiting probably 15 minutes or something." And she said, "Oh, well, there are sicker people than you ahead of the queue." There are people sicker than me. I hadn't actually thought that I'd become one of the boring ones, one of the ones that could just plod through the treatment and be all right, that it was no longer the drama.
And in a way, how did that feel, it not being the drama?
Well, what I did was immediately revert to the way I'd been coping, which was the editor persona. Went back to work, went back to Good Housekeeping, reinvented Good Housekeeping, again, redid the Good Housekeeping Institute. There's so many enormous benefits of hindsight, but what I should have done, go, right, that was a wake-up call. Nobody brings cancer on themselves, I'm not saying that, but that was a moment, it was a real fork in the road. and I took the route to more perfection.
Yeah, instead of taking a step back and
Yeah.
reassessing. I mean, it must feel like the least important thing in the world, but the chemo also brought on menopause, didn't it?
It did. Absolutely crashed into
On top of
menopause.
everything else.
Which, I say, I was treated in Harley Street. I had excellent treatment, but it was never discussed. It was never a thing. So I had these night sweats like you wouldn't believe. Well, you would believe.
I would believe,
You would
but
believe.
yeah. But I thought it's interesting when I was reading the book before you said that it brought on menopause, and you were talking about lying in a soaking bed, and I was thinking, God, it sounds like menopause, and I turned the page and it was menopause.
Yeah. The trouble with a chemically induced menopause, over and above even an ordinary menopause, which can be terrible, is that you crash into it very suddenly. I don't know if women in that situation are able to have conversations about it now during their treatment, but no one talked to me about that at all. So I'd got all these scars. I was sweating through all the sheets every night. Mark moved into the study so that I could get some sleep. Really, my sleep didn't recover from that, I don't think. I couldn't have HRT.
Is your breast cancer estrogen?
Very, very highly estrogen fueled, which is a good thing from the point of view of recovery. But in the past few years, they now say that it's okay to use topical estrogen creams.
Yes, I've interviewed Louise Newson and she has said that.
Yeah. Oh my God. Thank God for that. I've got a brilliant gynecologist who said men get prostate cancer, about the same numbers of men get prostate cancer as women get breast cancer. That's a hormone-fueled cancer. So they give them treatment to deplete their testosterone. They all go then, oh, men can't do without testosterone. So after 5 years, they then work to bring their hormone levels back to normal. A woman has breast cancer. They go, you don't want that nasty estrogen stuff, that's going to kill you. And that's it. And that's all that ever happens. So who knows? There may be developments, but at the moment, very grateful for what there has been.
And do you use topical estrogen now?
Yes, yeah.
And has that, because you also then got osteoporosis, didn't you?
Yeah.
Has the topical estrogen helped that?
No. This is literally just the very localized estrogen cream, which is, I'm told, the equivalent of 1 day of a patch. Oh, in a year, it's the equivalent of 1 day of a patch.
Oh, man.
So it's
okay.
very small. So I had to have the biphosphonates for the osteoporosis.
And so that was the point that you decided to move house, rebuild it from the ground up, and make your perfect home.
Yeah.
That's a whistle-stop tour.
Yeah.
Hey, it's Kaylee Cuoco for Priceline. Ready to go to your happy place for a happy price? Well, why didn't you say so? Just download the Priceline app right now and save up to 60% on hotels. So whether it's Cousin Kevin's Kazoo Concert in Kansas City, go Kevin, or Becky's Bachelorette Bash in Bermuda, you never have to miss a trip ever again. So download the Priceline app today. Your savings are waiting.
Go to your happy place for a happy price. Go to your happy price, Priceline.
So let's scroll forward, actually not that far, but to the accident that triggered everything else. I mean, had you been in your new house a couple of years?
No, 17 months.
17 months.
So not very long at all.
Tell us about the accident.
So I thought I'd basically conquered everything. I thought I'd conquered fate, conquered life. I believed I was in a happy marriage. Hope was she'd gone to university, which was amazing because everything that happened had impeded her reading and her schoolwork. But she'd ended up going to university and was working as a chef in a Michelin-starred kitchen. So I'd kind of done my mothering bit. We'd got through it. I was happily married. We were living in this beautiful house, which had taken 8 months to, we gutted and rebuilt. I celebrated my 60th birthday I had a big party. Mark made a speech and he said, "This woman changed my life. I love and adore her." Everyone remembered it, not a dry eye in the house. 1 month later, I'd been to visit my mother in Essex, and I was driving back on the Southend Arterial Road, which is a dual carriageway. It was about 7 o'clock in the evening, and there was a lorry in front of me, and all of a sudden, the lorry, which had been on the left of me, turned absolutely at right angles across the carriageway.
Terrifying.
And I was heading for it at 70 miles an hour. I braked and drove into the central barrier. I was braking and I was very worried that hitting the central barrier would cause me to flip over onto the other side. Hit the lorry, but the central barrier had closed, slowed me down enough. The front of my car disappeared onto the lorry. I couldn't actually believe I was alive. And I got out and the cars sort of slewing all over the road and chaos and mayhem. And I couldn't work out what had caused it. And then some 20 yards in front of the lorry, there was a man lying in the road and he tried to take his own life by running in front of the lorry. The lorry had swerved and jackknifed and caught the man a glancing blow. Incredibly, no one died. The man himself was taken to hospital. I mean, it took ages to move him because he was so badly injured. It was assumed he was going to die. So I was taken off to a service station in a police car with the dog. The poor old lorry driver, I felt very sorry for him. He looked awful.
Seriously traumatised.
Yeah, and he was driven away by the police. It was chaos, and the police arrived and it was all, nobody do anything. This could be, someone might die here.
At that point, it would have been reasonable to expect that your rescuer
Yes.
would have come to rescue you, but he didn't, did he?
I was in very deep shock and I didn't fathom that. So Hope, who was at work, because she worked in a kitchen, she worked at Le Manoir Quatre Saisons, drove virtually past our house and collected me. I didn't understand why that was.
Did you even think about it at the time?
No, because the next morning I went into work the day after.
Yeah, of course.
Of course I did, yeah.
Because it's your safe place.
It was my safe place, yeah. And then I realised that I just couldn't stop crying, so I had to go home. And I went and saw my GP who prescribed and sleeping tablets, and I was just in the past. I just went back to John's death, to Ellie's death, and that's where I was for about 10 days. And then I kind of decided I had to go back to work. And so I went back to work. So I never had the conversation, why didn't you come and get me?
It's difficult, isn't it? Because sitting where we're sitting in 2024 with all the conversation around trauma and PTSD, and like as you talk about in the book about Bessel van der Kolk and all of his amazing Body Keeps the Score work, it just seems so glaringly obvious that car crash triggered a massive... Well, it triggered.
Yeah.
Triggering in the
yes.
in the vernacular of,
Yeah.
But at the time, which was even, what was it, maybe 10 years ago, not quite 8 years ago, even still then, it wasn't.
I'm not sure that it is now, I mean...
Yeah, just amongst...
I think people talk about it a lot. There's not a lot of joining the dots. My GP was fantastic, but there's not a lot of joining the dots about this happened and then this happened and now you're feeling like this. There's still, and we see that in physical medicine as well. If you've got a number of different physical symptoms, it's very rare that someone stands back and says, do you know what, I think these all may be connected. So each thing that happened was treated as an isolated incident.
And then signed off as an isolated incident.
Yeah.
Instead of this massive pile-on of the thing after thing.
And of course, I was looking like a very successful, you knew me at work.
Yeah.
I looked very together, didn't I?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, scary Lindsay. But I think part of that editor armour is to be a bit scary, isn't it? There's a moment towards the end of the book when you talk about seeing a picture of yourself. And I have exactly the same experience. There's a picture of me when I was editing Red on Eurostar that John took when I wasn't aware of it. And now I look at that picture and I think you look ill, you look angry, cold, you look unhappy. And you talk about exactly that experience. That
Yeah, ill and angry. Yeah, those words, exactly. Yeah.
Do you think with all the thinking that you've done and all the therapy that you've had since, that the divorce was coming anyway? Or do you think that the car crash triggering all the grief that you'd been suppressing maybe then triggered that? I think you could have drifted through somehow.
I think if it wasn't the car crash, it would have been something else. And I think what happens when you get into that state is that, because look, someone else might have had that car crash. And if they weren't busy suppressing and I don't know whether my husband was having the affair at that point. I assume he was, but I don't know. Maybe he was. I just don't know because he's never talked about it. But I think I was ignoring a lot. I was suppressing a lot. And I think someone else who was more in touch with themselves could have been in that car crash that I was in. And their response could have been, wow, that was scary. That was horrible. I feel really upset by it. But hey, nobody died. And so they could have actually come out of it feeling stronger. And I think the problem is that if you are not in touch with yourself, if you are suppressing a lot, then when something happens, and it doesn't have to be as dramatic as that, but when something happens, then it just blows everything wide open.
And you were, all the time, you were flagellating yourself, weren't you, for not being strong enough, for not coping with it?
Because I wasn't used to not coping.
We set so much store on coping and being strong. And you use the word resilient over and over and over again. And resilience is such a double-edged sword. Yes, you know, from where I was standing, you know, when we worked together, amazing the stuff you had coped with. But nobody ever says, she shouldn't have to cope with that. She shouldn't have to be doing that and that and that and that, as well as that, as well as that, as well as that. And, you know, collecting the award for everything at the same time. The way that we lionize that, so damaging.
It is. But it's very, very frightening not to cope. It's very frightening. It's actually, even when terrible things have happened, like the death of John, the death of Ellie, there must have been something I could have done, is a bit of a security blanket to think, to finally acknowledge, as I had to in the end, there was nothing I could have done. There was nothing the best doctors in the world could do. Life is just, at times, awful, scary, brutal, and short. That's really terrifying. It's actually much easier to go through life thinking that you can do it all. That's actually, thinking you can do it all is the soft option.
Yeah. So what was the point when you realised you couldn't cope?
So I went back to work after the car crash, but I kept crying all the time and I didn't know why I kept crying. So I went on another business trip to Chile, which I loved.
I don't know how you managed to bag all these glamorous... I never had all these glamorous business trips.
No, it was my thing. It was my Good Housekeeping thing that I had to do everything. It said in the magazine, trip to Chile, I must go.
Yeah.
And it was great and I loved it. And then in the evening, when we were getting ready to go out to dinner, I would turn on the shower in the bathroom of my hotel and cry. Having cried, I would put my makeup on and go out to dinner. And I went to see my GP and I got prescribed antidepressants. And then it was February, about 4.5 months after the car crash. And I was watching television with Mark and he went to the loo and his phone buzzed and it was a message from a woman. Actually I just dissociated again. And when he came out of the loo, I said, who was that from? And he said, no one, it's private. And I said, we'll talk about this tomorrow. And we carried on watching the film. I was completely dissociating. About 5 days later, it happened again. He wouldn't talk about it. And if he did talk about it, he said we'd been living apart. been living apart. We only moved into this house just over a year ago. So about 5 days later, there was another message on the phone. I wanted to see it. I grabbed the phone, wouldn't let me have it. Then we both let go at the same time. The phone fell to the floor. And I thought, oh God, this is all going terribly wrong and I don't know what to do. And he picked up the landline and dialed 999 and said I'd assaulted him.
And that was literally what had happened?
Yeah.
At that point, had he said that he wanted a divorce or?
He said he wanted a divorce. I found us relationship therapists and made an appointment and we were going to go and see these counsellors, therapists who are supposed to be very good. And he said, no, he said, I've taken advice. We've been living apart. I said, no, we haven't been living apart. I'd been sleeping in another room because of my ongoing sleep problems, but we were very much a couple. Then after that, he sort of pursued this thing that if you say it often enough, it becomes true, really. Oh, no, we've been living apart, even though it was absolute nonsense. And what he'd said at my party, I mean, it was just bizarre, which didn't really help with me trying to get a handle on what reality was, to be perfectly honest.
No, you must have felt a bit gaslit. And what did he say that you had done? Did he say you'd done something other than...
He said, my wife smashed my phone and hit me with one of the pieces, and there are knives in the house.
There are knives in all houses.
There are knives in all houses, yeah. And we weren't in the kitchen.
And you didn't have a knife?
No.
So what happened next?
So 2 police cars arrived, flashing lights. I was arrested, put in the police car, taken to Hatfield Police Station, processed, fingerprinted. And actually the desk sergeant said, do you want a solicitor? I went, yes, I want a solicitor. There were other people being processed. There were some very young girls who didn't want a solicitor, I think, because they wanted to get back out on the streets. There was a man who, I guess from all his gold jewellery, looked like a drug dealer, although what he thought I was, I don't know. And I was taken to a cell.
And had you been at work editing a magazine that day?
Yes, I'd been on a photo shoot. In fact, that morning, I was standing on the platform at St John's Wood tube station, and I just thought, oh, there's a simple way out here. I'll just step in front of the train. And I didn't. I tell you, I've barely been on a tube since.
Yeah.
But I ran from the station, went to the photo shoot, directed the photo shoot, and then went to the loos and rang my lovely GP and said, I think I'm going to kill myself. And she told me to come immediately, which I did. That was the day. And then it was in the evening, the call to the police. So, it was domestic violence by women is very, very rare. It's not unknown. The police have to assume anything could happen. What they should do is take someone through a checklist, which they didn't. If they'd taken me through the checklist, I had been suicidal and I'd been to my GP that afternoon. I should never, ever. I was locked in a cell for 16 and a half hours. You should never lock someone suicidal, actively suicidal, alone for 16 and a half hours.
And I can't help wondering, and I can literally hear some of your listeners audibly groaning, but I can't help wondering whether a man would have been,
there's actually research in this. There's research in this. 2009 from the University of Bristol. A woman is 3 times more likely to be arrested than a man following an allegation like that. If it had been reversed, if I'd made the call, there was only a third possibility that my husband would be arrested. A surprisingly large number of women are arrested in these circumstances. Very few charges are brought. Of those that are brought, very few stand up in court. That's not to say it never happens. It does happen. And obviously, it's very difficult for the police in those moments to decide what actually is going on. But the fact is, the police bring a preconceived idea to the situation that if this accusation is levelled at a woman, it is more likely to be true than if it is levelled at a man.
And the grounds for that are?
Misogyny.
Yes.
Honestly, I know that's jumping to the punchline. But
but it's
because they're like not borne out by facts.
Women are more likely to cry wolf.
Yeah, something like that. Yeah.
It's just mind-blowing. You weren't able to go home.
No. So I was interrogated for 45 minutes so they could find no validity to the accusations at all. I had a duty solicitor, and afterwards the duty solicitor and the police officer said to me, "Where are you going?" And I went, "I'm going home. I've got this beautiful house. You should see it. It's amazing." They said, "You can't go home." I said, "What do you mean?"
But you weren't accused of anything.
No.
You were just...
Yeah. I said, "I didn't do it." And they said, "No, he might say it again."
So they were saying to protect yourself, you should not go home.
Yeah.
So where did you go?
I went to my mother's house. I didn't tell her where I'd been. It took me 4 years before I could tell her what had happened. Still wearing the clothes that I'd spent the night in the cell. And in the morning I went to work.
Of course.
Of course!
Which kind of brings us to the punchline. And before I get to the punchline, I do want to say to the listeners, it's going to be all right. It's not a spoiler. Say, it's going to be all right. It is going to be all right. And we might even get cheerful.
Yeah.
You went to your mother's, and the next day you went to work. And then the final thread holding you together
I got made
was
redundant.
cut. I mean, we should say that it was a big company-wide restructure, but I think everybody thought, I mean, I no longer worked there, but I think everybody thought, even if nobody else is all right, Lindsay will be. But you had a kind of a weird premonition before you were made redundant, hadn't you?
I mean, I'd lived through lots of rounds of redundancy. I mean, the way magazines had been going for a few years.
Going that way when I left, I think.
Yeah. And with every round of redundancy that happened, and I had to give the bad news to people who were affected, I always survived and got more responsibility. And then I was on my way into work, and the handle of my Mulberry handbag snapped, and all of my possessions sort of scattered on the floor, on the ground, on the pavement. And I was kneeling on the floor, kind of gathering up notebook, pen, tissues, lipsticks, and so on. I thought, I'm not going to survive this one. And I didn't.
Felt like a sign.
Yeah, it was a sign, yeah. And without my safe space of work, that's when I really, really fell apart.
I mean, your safe space was taken away, but also, your identity, your armour. If you think about your armour as being more like not protecting you from the outside, but protecting you from the inside, and it's suddenly pulled off.
Yeah, it was, basically what I did was drink. I was swigging wine from a bottle at 10 o'clock in the morning. Absolutely. And I got angry. And I was living in a rented house because Mark had refused to move out of our house.
And change the locks.
And change the locks, yeah. So there's nothing, changing the locks against your wife, that's the thing. So I went to court and I got an occupation order, and he had to move out, and I moved back in. And then I thought, bear in mind, I am, technical definition, barking mad at this point. Mm. I thought, I know, I need a job, I have to work. I'll be a life coach. I'll tell other people how to live their life.
Oh, God. So this was before, at this point, you hadn't had therapy and you hadn't been talked to anyone about, no one had talked to you about PTSD?
No, I'd had quite a lot of therapy, and I'd already embarked on EMDR therapy, which is brilliant. But therapy isn't a magic bullet, it's a process. It sounds like it didn't work. I think it did, because otherwise I would have never stopped the drinking wine at 10 o'clock in the morning. And also, if you tell your therapist, I've decided I'm going to be a life coach, I'm going to California. I went to California to study.
Yeah.
Yes.
I mean, losing that job that had been arguably everything to you, that you had given everything to. I mean, albeit in the context of the industry is going through the floor, this is in no way personal. That just must have absolutely shaken you to your very sense of who you were.
It did. And Hope, around whom I'd focused my life for so long, was going off into the world. She hadn't quite left home at that point, but she was. She was seeing someone that she was serious about, and she got a career and so on. So, yeah, I had no identity. I didn't know that there was a me who was an editor, a mother, and a wife. I didn't know that beyond all those labels, there was someone else.
But that someone else was inside fighting all the fires, weren't they?
Yeah.
At what point did you start to see a glimmer of, I kind of want to say, oh, I was going to say old Lindsay, but it's not old Lindsay, is it? It's a new Lindsay.
No, I think old Lindsay's gone. Yeah, kind of miss her, but she's gone.
What do you miss about her?
She wasn't scared of anything. Now I get scared. Now I know there are things I can't do. Old Lindsay just railroaded through everything. And that was quite nice. I'd love to be able to put that on some occasions, but it seems like she's gone. I'd always loved horses when I was growing up. I never had the time for it because I was working so hard. So I started volunteering at Riding for the Disabled because I'd got osteoporosis, didn't think I could get back on a horse. Absolutely, volunteering saved my life. You think you're the most hard done by person in the world, and you go and you find you're not even the most hard done by person in your postcode. There are. And to actually have a reason to get up and go somewhere in the morning.
Yeah, after all that structure.
Yeah.
All those places you had to be, all those people you couldn't let down, all of a sudden, nobody's waiting for you at 9 a.m.
So I started volunteering. I started writing. And in between that, I was volunteering fully into the therapy, not just bits of therapy, fully into the therapy, lots and lots of reading and study, realizing that I really just regarded my physical body as a meat suit in which my brain was carried around. And I ignored it. Never felt pain. I never felt cold. I never felt hunger and so on. And then because I was at rock bottom, I had to feel those feelings and I had to start looking after myself.
What made that happen? What made you put down the bottle of wine at 10 a.m. in the morning and start looking after yourself? Because, you had been at a point where rather than do that, you were stood on the tube platform.
I had nowhere else to go. There was a point, I was in California, I was working with horses as therapy. And this coach who was coaching, and I'd been around horses a lot. I thought I knew all about horses, and this horse was paying no attention to me whatsoever. And the coach called out, "You're in your head. You're in your head." Of course, I'm in my head. I'm always in my head. She said, "What are your feet doing?" "What are my feet doing? My feet? Can you feel your feet? Squash them into shoes."
I'm looking at your feet. They look fine to me.
I wear trainers now. You're never safe unless you feel your feet.
Do you mean on a horse, or was that a
ground.
metaphor for life?
It's a metaphor for life. And it actually goes back to our hunter-gatherer past when we had to run away from danger. You had to know what the ground was like to run over. I understood that my husband had frankly been very unkind to me, but that there were probably signs of that which I had been consciously ignoring. Because I was always up in my head, and my head said I wanted this perfect relationship in this perfect house with my perfect job. And I was ignoring. I don't know what the things I ignored were, to be honest.
Because you ignored them.
Because I ignored them. Couldn't tell you what they were. But I do know now what happened wasn't really out of the blue. If I'd been paying attention to my surroundings, to my life, I would not. You joked earlier about the drama. That's why there was so much drama in my life. I mean, there were very sad things that nobody could foresee, but there were things that would not have been so dramatic or so awful if I'd seen the warning signs or if I'd seen the little red flags. And I wasn't looking at those because I was so determined to live my life exactly as I wanted it.
Well, so much had happened that was out of your control. Keeping everything in your control must have felt like the be-all and end-all.
Yeah, it was. Yeah.
There's a thing you say that kind of made me laugh, but it's also so true. It made me laugh because I recognised it. You talk about the way when you edit a magazine, you're never living in real time. And that was really extreme on Good Housekeeping, even more extreme than it is on most monthlies, because you literally are doing Christmas in July. And I know it's mocked, and it was, it was one of the big jokes behind Absolutely Fabulous, but that's the reality, isn't it? you do not live in real time if you edit a monthly magazine. It might be different now if you're still editing one and you're driven by the website. So you are completely, even the most on it person, the most with it psychologically, is dissociated from the natural world.
Yes, totally. Yeah, totally. It's Christmas in July. In the run-up to real Christmas, everyone wants to take afternoons off to go Christmas shopping and have Christmas lunches and so on. You're going, no, it's spring. It's spring. You know, we've got to do spring cleaning and spring fashion and Easter bakes and things. You know, you're never...
And having to get that issue to press before Christmas.
Yeah.
Get the March cover signed off.
Yes.
Which comes out in February anyway.
Yes. So nothing is real. But, you know, worked on lots of magazines, but Good Housekeeping was my home for the longest time, for 18 years. But I now know that what I was doing through those pages was creating the home life I didn't have in real life.
Mm. You talked about, you know, feeling your feet and living more in your body and volunteering and being of service. But there's a third thing, isn't there, that has brought you back. Not back to yourself, into your new self.
Yeah. So I got a horse. Childhood dream, got a horse, despite the osteoporosis. And I was very scared a lot of the time because I'm quite old and I was afraid of breaking bones and things, but it was all going well. And then one day he took off with me. He bolted and we were heading for a fence and I thought he was going to jump it.
And what would the consequence of that been? Either you or him? Or both?
Yeah, so on the other side of the fence was a rutted field. I mean, the fence was very high. He would have had a go at it. He'd have probably hit the fence and we'd have somersaulted over. He'd have broken a leg, I'd have broken my neck. Was the most likely scenario. And just as it happened in the crash, time really, really, really slowed down. It's extraordinary the way time slows down like that. And I thought, this is it. I thought I was going to die in the car crash. And now here I am and I'm actually going to die. Well, there's only one thing I can do. And I had to pull on one rein and pull him round in a circle. He didn't want to do it, but then he gave in. I managed to bring him to a halt. And basically I had saved myself when I thought I wasn't worth saving. And after that, I had very, very, very intense flashbacks about Ellie's death, which is probably the ultimate of being helpless, being absolutely helpless. And when I was told, apparently I said, I don't remember this, apparently I said, oh, I'm terribly tired. And I was in one of those little rooms they take you into in a hospital. And I lay down on the sofa. It was thought I was asleep, but I wasn't. I actually was unconscious for about 15 minutes. And that had sort of embedded the trauma in my body.
So your brain shut down?
My brain just shut down. Basically, my body tried to die to join my daughter. I think that was the point where me and my body kind of parted ways and, on agreeing with stuff, basically. Because my body had said, let's just die. And something didn't. So I had this very strong flashback to that. And then it was also the most amazing healing moment because I had been in a moment of peril and I had done what I could. It might not have worked, but it did work. And that actually gave me the confidence to think that I could save myself.
Yeah, all those times that you felt like you hadn't been able to save, the people you loved and something clicked into place.
Yeah.
And what does your path look like now?
It's great. Honestly, I would not have believed my life now is better than it was. I have a portfolio of things. On Mondays, I look after my granddaughter. On Tuesday, I was chairing a meeting of a college that I run. On the Wednesday, I did some writing and I did an interview with Woman's Hour. Thursday, I forget what I did on Thursday, maybe had a day off or something. And on Friday, I teach disabled children to ride horses. And they were like, you can actually build a life that has those things. Yeah, you can.
It feels really inappropriately glib to ask you the questions I always ask at the end.
That's right.
What is your emotional age?
Some of the time I'm between 35 and 45, which was the years during and after John and Ellie's death. And I really didn't experience those years because I was so mired in grief. The age I like to go to, if I can, is age 7. It's the first time I ever sat on a horse. Oh, it was a pony on the beach at Walton-on-the-Naze. And I sat on the horse and it was amazing. And I thought, wow, if I could ride horses, and I loved books already at age 7, and read books, write books. If I could ride horses, write books, life would be perfect. So most of the time I'm channeling age 7.
And that's what you're doing now.
Yeah.
Give us a book recommendation.
So the book that took me off to California, which you don't have to go to California, you can just buy the book. It's
just as well.
It's a book called Steering by Starlight by Martha Beck. It book's quite old now. She's got a new book coming out about anxiety, which I'm really looking forward to. Be so important. But honestly, Steering by Starlight, I don't think it's dated at all. I keep it by my bed. I've got 4 copies in my house. I was going to bring you one, Sam, but I've written notes in all of them, so I couldn't. But basically, it's sort of how to work your life out 101.
I need to go and track that down after this, and I'll definitely track down the new one. What advice would you give younger women?
Keep feeling your feet.
Who is your old bird role model?
Well, we've sadly just lost her, but Shirley Conran.
Oh, yeah, she died last week.
She did, yeah. So Shirley was a friend, and I worked with her on some projects, been working with her on projects.
That's one of the questions I didn't get to ask you.
She always described her life as a zigzag. So, I mean, she wrote Superwoman when she was 40 because she was divorced and broke and ill with ME. So she wrote Superwoman, and then she married 2 more times, lost the money she made from Superwoman. So she wrote Lace, which basically created the whole sex and shopping genre, and made so much money that she went to live in Monaco. And then when she was 66, now that's an age when people think nothing new is going to happen. When she was 66, she sold up in France, came back to the UK and set up the Work-Life Balance Trust. And then she celebrated her 91st birthday. Then she told me she was going to take a sabbatical. So she's 91, she took a sabbatical, during which we'd been talking about her memoirs. She really cracked on with her memoirs. Then she became unwell, went into hospital. They said, and her friends were told, the end was close. And she sent for a hairdresser.
Well, what are you? Are you 65, 66?
67.
67.
Yeah.
Crack on.
So that was the age at which Shirley started her career before the career that she...
Exactly.
I mean, I've got 2 more
after
careers.
Your own heart.
Yeah.
What's your superpower? Now it's no longer dissociation.
It was dissociation, yeah. So one of the people who read a proof copy, Fern Britton, in fact, described Perfect Bound as an open letter to women who are suffering, which I loved. That was such a lovely thing to say. So I hope my superpower is to communicate and connect with women who are suffering.
The superpower of any good magazine editor should be to communicate with their reader, their woman. And it's a mind-blowing book. And I really do urge everybody listening to read it. And I don't say that every episode, as you'll know, because you've listened. And last one, how many fucks do you give?
Oh, I used to give so many. I was a complete fuck factory, giving so many fucks. Very, very conscious. I think they started leaving the building when the door of the police cell slammed shut. And that was when the fucks started leaving the building. They're all gone now.
Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed The Shift and would like to show your appreciation, why not buy me a coffee? Go to www.buymeacoffee.com/The Shift with Sam Baker. You can hear a new episode of The Shift every Tuesday, wherever you get your podcasts. And if you like what you hear, please do rate, review, follow, tell your friends, because it really does help other people find us. And if you'd like to know more about my own experience of shifting, my book, The Shift, How I Lost and Found Myself After 40, and you can too, is out now in paperback.